All right, taping this 7 o'clock on Sunday night. Wanted to talk quickly about what's going on with the NBA these last few days. So you had everyone thinking that we were headed toward Orlando at the end of July to play a few regular season games and the playoffs. We thought everything was settled. There was a big Ramona Shelburne piece on ESPN.com about Adam Silver and Bob Iger and Chris Paul coming together and figuring this whole thing out. And then I think over the past week, two things happened. One, it was unclear by all accounts just how much of a bubble this thing was going to be in Disney, because it seemed like, you know, the players and coaches and team employees are going to be quarantined, but then Disney was also going to be a little bit open too. And what about those people? So all of a sudden, from a safety standpoint, it didn't seem 100%. And then on top of it, it really started to come out, like how long people had to be there, the quarantine thing, when families could come, they couldn't leave. So all that side got, I think, just a little more serious as we got a little bit closer. But then we also had a lot of the players talking amongst themselves, wondering if they should keep going with the season, whether the moment that this country is having right now and the position that they hold, both with fans and with people, and, you know, in a lot of cases as African Americans, whether it was more important for them to do the things they need to do with their platforms for the country than it was to play basketball. And you had a whole bunch of different positions kind of coming out of this. And, you know, you have Kyrie basically saying, this is what Shams Charania quoted him as saying, "I don't support going into Orlando. I'm not with the systemic racism and the bullshit. Something smells a little fishy. Whether we want to admit it or not, we are targeted as black men every day we wake up." You had Steven Jackson, one of my favorites. He said, quote, "None of these white owners have spoken up. None of them are taking a stand. Playing basketball ain't going to do nothing but make them money and take attention off what we are fighting for." But then you had guys like Austin Rivers, who pointed out 99% of the players haven't made the money Kyrie has. I love Kyrie's passion toward helping this movement. I'm with it, but in the right way and not at the cost of the whole NBA and players' careers. We can do both. We can play and we can help change the way black lives are lived. And then you had Patrick Beverley, who said, "Hoopers say what y'all want. If King James said he hooping, we all hooping. Not personal, only business. Hashtag stay woke." There was also a lot of stuff that came out about concerns of players who have a chance to sign big max extensions. Are they going to be insured? Real pressure on the players right now about if the season does get canceled, that allows the NBA to invoke the force majeure clause. It causes $1.2 billion in losses for the players and for the owners. It has a dramatic impact on the salary cap. It completely changes the history of the league in the sense that we won't have a champion for a season for the first time. There are all these different things. The counter to all of that is the moment that America is having right now. The tension, the protests, the platforms of some of these guys are just more important than basketball. And that should win at the end. So I don't know how this is going to play out. My guess is it's probably going to get a little more contentious over the next couple of days. And then eventually they'll end up playing, because I think the prevailing wisdom will be that the stage that they'll be able to have for 9 to 10 straight weeks, playing games, capturing the country's attention, and all the things that they can do with that stage as they're playing is the best possible use of their platform. But if they decide that that's not the case, and if guys don't want to go, or if ultimately the whole thing falls apart, that's okay too. I think what's cool is that they're talking about it, and they're talking about it in real ways, which brings me to 1968, even though the circumstances were completely different. And as crazy as this sounds, they were even bleaker and sadder and more disturbing than everything we're going through now. But Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th. It was the day before the conference finals were going to start with it was the Celtics against the Sixers in the East. And I think it was the Lakers against the Hawks in the West. So game one was the night after Martin Luther King gets assassinated. The players are in shock. And I deep dove. I tried to read everything there was online about this. There's not as much information as I remember there being when I wrote my book, but all the relevant stuff's out there. The the black players were, completely devastated, in shock, and they assumed the game was going to get canceled. Nobody on the Philly side really did anything, they didn't really hear from anybody. They woke up the next day. There's stuff about Chet Walker called Hal Greer. Neither of them could figure out what was going on. Wilt Chamberlain, who's playing for Philly at the time, he called the Sixers GM, Jack Ramsey. Jack Ramsey told him the game had to be played because all the tickets had been sold. It was on television. They couldn't kind of call the game back. And then Bill Russell, who was not just the best player in the Celtics and the best player of the first 25 years of the league, he was also coaching the Celtics at the time. He calls Wilt, and the two of them tried to figure out what to do. Neither of them wanted to play, according to all the information. There was a feeling. Both teams are telling players, and I think the players probably felt it too, that there was rioting going on all over the country, and the players were being pressured, like, hey, if we cancel this game, that could make it even worse. Maybe if you end up playing, it could take people's minds on this for a couple hours. Arbeck called a team meeting. The Celtics talked it out with Russell leading the way because he was the coach. Apparently, it was a tense conversation, and one Celtic wondered, Bailey Howell wondered why the idea was even being discussed. He was quoted as saying, "What was King's title? Why should we call off the game?" Some of the black players took that very personally, but Russell said later, they worked through it. They were all really close. And remember, back then, the guys are just hanging out 24/7. That Celtics team in particular had been through a ton of stuff and had really led the way in all kinds of different directions with civil rights in the 60s for the NBA. Russell was the first black coach. It was the first team that started 5 black players. Russell was the most important guy in the league, and they were going to figure this out. And Russell said that he reminded the team, quote, "This isn't black and white. It's an American problem." So they got through it. They decided they were going to play. Wayne Embry was Russell's backup center, and we came up huge in Game 7. He was also the first black general manager in 1972. But he remembers it as, quote, "They wanted to keep people off the streets or at least delay it. They thought the arena would be packed and people would be glued to the television. Of course, our immediate reaction was we didn't want to play. We were stunned in the morning and angry, but we understood we could serve a greater purpose." So then Wilt wrote about this in one of his books. He said, Red Auerbach called the Boston players together. They talked about whether or not they should play the game or ask for postponement. They agreed to play. The day of the game, they came to Philadelphia together, united in their grief and in their determination. But Alex, who's Alex Hannum, the Sixers coach at the time, but Alex didn't think to call a player meeting. Most of us didn't see each other until we got into the locker room that night. Remember, no cell phones, nothing. I mean, it's a completely different era. Like Boston, we were grief-stricken, but we were confused, bewildered, uncertain. It showed that night. And then the Celtics, they ended up winning by 9. A couple other notes about that game. The commissioner was Walter Kennedy. He led the decision of whether the game should be played. He left that up to the 2 owners. And then and somebody said at one point, if this was the president, it would be one thing. Remember, a few years before, the NFL had decided to play after JFK was assassinated and took a ton of shit for that. The Sixers, Wilt actually called for a vote before about an hour before the game. And the players voted 7-2 to play. Wilt and Wally Jones were on the side of postponing, and Chet Walker refused to vote. So, and Wilt was quoted as saying, "I would personally like to see the whole day taken off as some kind of memorial to Dr. King, but I'm only one individual. I don't want to instigate anything. I'll follow the majority." So they end up playing. New York Times, Leonard Koppett was there, And he wrote that quote, "It was the eeriest, most subdued sporting event I've ever seen." Meanwhile, there's not any information on what was going on in the Western Finals, but in Elgin Baylor, he wrote a book called Hang Time, autobiography. He said, quote, this is how he felt at the time. "I frankly don't know how I will play the next night. I feel stunned, angry, and deeply sad. Our voice has been stilted. I feel the NBA should postpone all playoff games. I called Bill Russell, player coach of the Celtics. He tells me some players want to play, several want to postpone. I don't ask which players want to play. I don't want to know. I picture certain players in the Celtics and even guys on our team, mostly from the South, who I doubt can understand what Dr. King meant to me, to us. I hear comments, quote, 'He wasn't the president or anything. Why should we call off the game?' End quote. The games go on as scheduled. And then President Johnson declares Sunday, April 7th, the National Day of Mourning. And that lifts my spirits somewhat." So the funeral was, they postponed game 2, and Russell and Wilt went to the funeral in Atlanta. And so I knew about all this, and I spent 2 days with Russell in 2012, did it for a documentary that NBA TV did, also did a podcast about it on the Book of Basketball feed, about a lot about that day, and just really probably the most amazing experience of my entire career. But at one point I asked Russell about that whole week and what it was like. And here's what he said. We're talking about 1968 and when Martin Luther King got assassinated. What do you remember now? It's been almost 45 years since that happened.
Well, I had met him at the March on Washington.
And you were there for the I Have a Dream speech.
Yes. In fact, I was invited to go on the stage, but I respectfully declined because they had been working on that for more than a year, and I hadn't done anything. And I didn't think it was right or fair to me go up on the stage and say, "See, I'm one of the guys."
Yeah.
And so I sat in the first row.
So you get the news that he's been killed. You're about to play the Sixers in the 68 playoffs.
Well, they asked us, do you want to call the game off? And someone pointed out that 12 or 13,000 people on the streets with emotions off the chart. And if we play the game, they'd give the folks a chance to cool down. And that's the reason we had the game.
So you're glad you had the game in retrospect. It seems like it was the right idea.
I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. We did what we thought was right at that time. So when I asked him that, it was 44 and a half years later, and he still didn't know the answer. And I think that's an important point. This is one of the 3 best players of all time, one of the most important athletes ever. And this was a really big decision, and he was a thoughtful guy, and he had been thinking about it ever since, and he still didn't know if they should play. So when I think about the moment that the NBA is facing right now, and these guys who, I think this is the best generation of players from, I don't know, a maturity standpoint that we've ever seen. And I don't really fully understand it, how guys who are 22 and 23 can be so thoughtful about all this stuff. I just know what I was like in my early 20s. I was a jackass. I'm just constantly impressed by, a lot of the guys in this league. It's a really special group of guys. And I think it's important that they're taking this time. And however this plays out, I don't think there should be, a sports take type thing. And what'd you think? Or Kyrie, this is not about that. This is about a decision that they have to make, not only to be away from their families for this long, but also something that 44 and a half years from now, they're going to look back at and wonder if they made the right call. So if that takes a few days to figure out, and you need more dialogue, and you need maybe a couple calls with some people screaming at each other, I think all that is great. Because if you go back and read, a situation that's similar in a couple ways, but dissimilar in a whole bunch of other ways, what happened in 1968, they kind of rushed it, and they had to rush it. The league wasn't in the same position of strength it's in now. The players couldn't communicate the way they can communicate now But the aftermath was that 44 and a half years later, Bill Russell didn't know if they should have played or not. So I'm glad they're taking the time. I think, I know just even from my end, I've taken a lot of time the last 2.5 weeks just thinking about everything and, reevaluating, which I think is super important. And with this, like if they end up deciding that they shouldn't play, that this is the wrong moment to do that, that other things are more important, then that's what they should do. But I think the important thing is to keep talking, keep batting it around, and get to the right place with it. So I just want to say that.